Hello again. To sentence a teenage boy to remain in prison until he is 70 is a fearful thing, but some people yesterday thought such a sentence too lenient, a sign that we in Britain were perhaps going soft on crime. These people wanted to see Axel Rudakubana being hanged, instead of being sent to prison for a minimum of 52 years. It's an awfully long time since we hanged anybody for a crime committed when he was just 17 years of age. The last such case was that of Charles Dobell, who was hanged at Maidstone Prison in January 1889 at the age of 17. In other words, the suggestion is being made that we should turn the clock back to the Victorian era, at least in this one particular case. Obviously, one cannot just change the law simply to make it possible to execute one person. And so what is really being called for here is a law which allows for the hanging of teenagers. Of course, it might be argued that within living memory we were hanging teenagers. One remembers the execution of Francis Forsyth in 1960 at Wandsworth Prison, and also 19-year-old Anthony Miller in Glasgow a few months later. Even at that time, though, it was thought to be a pretty terrible thing, and a few years after those executions, the death penalty fell into disuse before being abolished at the end of the 1960s. There have been calls for the return of hanging from time to time, for instance during the trial of Ian Brady and Mara Hindley, in the wake of the Shepherd's Bush police murders in 1966, and also, of course, during the IRA bombing campaign in the 1970s. These were aberrations, though, and there was never the least chance of the return of hanging. Watching death penalty trending on Twitter yesterday in connection with the sentencing of Axel Rudakubana to 52 years imprisonment, I had the same feeling that I had on those previous occasions. That, firstly, it would never happen. Secondly, that it was a good thing that it would not. The actual mechanism and procedure of executing people in this country were both absolutely hideous. The stuff of nightmares. One of my books, Execution, A History of Capital Punishment in Britain, which was published 15 years ago, is regarded as a pretty definitive work on the subject. That's why I'm engaged from time to time as a consultant on executions and the death penalty in this country by the makers of television dramas and so on. The details of what actually happened during hangings are such that I would not wish such a fate on anybody in the world, even a mad killer like Rudakubana. I suspect that those who call for the return of hanging cannot really visualize what executions actually entailed. I do not believe that anybody in the world should be subjected to judicial death, regardless of the crimes which they have committed. The death penalty is a classic case of a cure being worse than the disease. Murder is a terrible enough thing, but deliberately ending the life of somebody in cold blood by hanging, shooting or gassing them is infinitely worse.